The sacred texts say that only 8 people crossed the flood, but that number hides a huge secret. There was a 4th son of Noah who rejected the ark and built something that official history erased forever. For millennia, his name was erased from the Bible with a precision that can only be called a total conspiracy. However, medieval Arabic manuscripts and the oldest Islamic texts remember him with absolute clarity. His name was Yam, and his story is the oldest conspiracy of silence that humanity has ever carried out. He was not a rebel without a cause. He was the guardian of a knowledge so dangerous that God himself wanted to eliminate it. The question that no theologian has wanted to answer is what Yam knew that made him more fearsome than the flood. The texts that escaped censorship suggest that its fortress was built with plans of non-human origin. To understand the real flood, we must recover the fragments that official history declared too dangerous. What you are about to hear does not appear in any manual, but it is written in sources thousands of years old. The Quran in Surah 11, verses 42 and 3, describes the scene with a clarity that is chilling. Noah calls to his son from the ark as the water rises, and the son replies that the high mountain will protect him. That response is not from a desperate man. It is from someone with a plan laid out well in advance. Classical Islamic commentators al-Tabari and Ibn Kathir identified that son directly by the name of Yam. Al-Tabari wrote in his chronicles that Yam had rejected his father's faith before the ark began. But al-Tabari does not explain why a rational man would reject the only boat in the world in the face of a global flood. The answer lies in texts that medieval compilers did not include for fear of theological consequences. The Book of Enoch, preserved entirely only in the Ethiopian Canaan, describes the Watchers descending to Mount Hermon. Those Watchers taught men metallurgy, stone architecture, and non-human construction techniques. The Ethiopian text specifies that this knowledge was passed down to chosen family lines before the divine judgment. Noah was perfect in his generations, as Genesis 6:9 says, which implies total, absolute genealogical purity. But her children did not share that condition, and the apocryphal texts point to Yam as the most distant from it. The Book of Jubilees describes deep family tensions in Noah's house before the great universal flood. Those tensions were not generational conflicts. They were two completely irreconcilable worldviews. Noah believed in salvation through divine obedience. Yam believed in salvation through technical knowledge and hard stone. The fortress that Yam built was not an architectural whim. It was the expression of engineering of superhuman origin. The Watchers, according to Enoch, had built structures on Earth that defied known natural laws. Those structures used mathematical proportions that we now find encoded in monuments throughout the ancient world. Yam had inherited those plans and that technical ability that none of his 3 brothers ever came to possess. The rejection of the Ark was the assertion of having a technology superior to the solution proposed by his father. Medieval Arabic texts describe the fortress of Yam as a colossal structure in the heights of a region. Some sources place it in eastern Anatolia, where, interestingly, the traditions of Noah's Ark also converge. That geographical coincidence is not accidental. Both traditions point exactly to the same area of the ancient world. The fortress was designed with a principle that modern engineers would recognize as advanced hydrodynamic management. Their walls did not withstand the water. Instead, they diverted it using the very energy of the flood against itself. That principle appears in the texts as wisdom from celestial beings, not as a discovery made by humans. Inside there were libraries carved in stone and metal, built to survive long beyond any flood. Their guardians were not mere builders, they were priests and astronomers trained by the tradition of the Watchers. The fortress had seed deposits, astronomical records, and genealogies engraved on imperishable materials. Everything was designed so that a small, prepared group could rebuild an entire civilization from scratch. Not from the faith of Noah, but from the technical and cosmological knowledge that the Watchers had brought to the earth. When the flood came, the ark floated carrying the biological seed of pure humanity to the empty new world. But the fortress of Yam stood firm in the heights, preserving the technical knowledge of the entire antediluvian era. The waters of the flood did not uniformly cover all the earth, according to very ancient Islamic and apocryphal traditions. Certain heights remained, emerged, and functioned as islands in the apocalyptic ocean that swept away all civilization. The fortress was on one of those strategic heights, which proves that its location was calculated in advance. When the waters receded, two groups of survivors descended into the fertile valleys of the empty new world. From Mount Ararat descended Noah's family, bearers of the divine covenant and the mandate to repopulate the earth. From the fortress descended the survivors of Yam, bearers of something completely different and much older. They carried blueprints of structures that the post-diluvian world would take millennia to reproduce, and some could never do so. They carried the astronomical knowledge of the Watchers, stellar cycles, constellations, and calculations of cosmic precession. And they carried, according to the most compromising texts that survived censorship, the genetic memory of the Nephilim. The term Nephilim appears in Genesis 6:2 and 4 with an ambiguity that translators have maintained for centuries. They were the children of the Watchers with human women, beings of height and ability that exceeded human parameters. Rabbinic tradition extensively debated whether the Nephilim all died in the flood, or if some managed to survive. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggests that the issue was much more complex. That text describes the Nephilim debating their fate before the flood, which implies that they had prior knowledge. If the Nephilim knew what was coming, some would have taken steps to preserve their lineage beyond the water. Yam, who inherited the knowledge of the Watchers, was the perfect link between humanity and that hidden tradition. It is no coincidence that her name, Canaan, is identical to that of the region that the Bible will describe as inhabited by giants. Genesis 10:19 establishes the territory of Canaan, including exactly the areas where the Rephaim will appear. The Rephaim were one of the giant peoples that the Israelites encountered upon arriving in the Promised Land. Deuteronomy 3:11 describes Og of Bashan with an iron bed that is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Those dimensions are not literary exaggeration. They are a technical fact recorded because they corresponded to a physical reality. And the Bashan ruled lands that had been part of the original territory assigned to Noah's fourth son. The sons of Anak, who terrified Moses' spies according to Numbers 13:33, lived right there. The spies said they were like locusts in their eyes, describing an absolutely real physical difference in scale. That difference was not a spontaneous post-diluvian mutation. It was the continuation of a genetic line that crossed the water. He crossed into the fortress of Yam, preserved in the heights, while the known world disappeared beneath the deluge. The Rephaim were not the only giant people that Israel encountered in the lands of Canaan upon arriving from Egypt. The Emim inhabited the region of Moab and were described in Deuteronomy as being as tall and numerous as the Anakites. The Zomzomaeans, also mentioned in the same chapter, occupied Ammon before the Ammonites forcibly displaced them. Each of those towns inhabited exactly the geographical areas consistent with the dispersion from the fortress of Yam. The geographical distribution is not random. It forms a radial expansion pattern from a well-defined point of origin. That point of origin, if the lines of dispersion are drawn on the map of ancient Middle East, points to the north. It points to the eastern Anatolia region and the mountains of Kurdistan, the exact area where the texts locate the fortress. The final destination of that genetic line and that technical knowledge is found in the two most mysterious empires in the world. Sumer appeared in Mesopotamia suddenly and fully formed around the 4th millennium BC Christ. Archaeologists found no gradual learning curve. Sumer appeared already fully developed. Cuneiform writing, the legal system, mathematical astronomy, and monumental architecture all emerged at the same time. The Sumerian royal list records antediluvian kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, figures impossible for humans. If those kings were the Watchers or their Nephilim descendants, their long reigns take on a different logic. The Anunnaki from the Sumerian texts are described as beings who came from above to teach the arts of civilization. Anu, Enlil, and Enki are not simple mythological deities. They are the preserved memory of the Watchers who survived. The tablets of Eridu describe the moment when royalty descended from the sky for the second time after the Great Flood. That second descent of royalty is the historical record of the arrival of the survivors from Yam to Mesopotamia. They arrived with already formed astronomical knowledge and a fully developed sexagesimal mathematical system in advance. The base 60 that we use in our clocks and in our angular geometry has no known precedents in the region. The legal code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known, also has no precedence as it appeared complete without previous versions. Everything points to a transfer of pre-existing knowledge. Someone brought that knowledge before the catastrophic flood. The irrigation system of the oldest Sumerian cities also has no evidence of observable gradual development. It appears to be functioning, complete, and efficient, as if its builders always knew exactly what they were doing. The ziggurat-shaped temples reproduce proportions that reappear in monuments of cultures that never had contact. That repetition of proportions in distant cultures can only be explained by a common origin prior to all of them known. That common origin is the repository of knowledge that the guardians of the fortress of Yam carried after the flood. The second major recipient of Yam's inheritance was Egypt, where the situation is even more disturbing and strange. The texts from the Egyptian Archaic period mention the Shem-Su-Hor, followers of Horus, as pre-Diluvian rulers. Maniton, an Egyptian priest from the 3rd century before Christ mentioned by Josephus, described a dynasty of ancient demigods. That dynasty ruled thousands of years before the dynastic history that the Egyptians recorded in detail began. The demigods of Manetho are, within the framework we reconstruct, the descendants of the Yam lineage, settled along the Nile. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of the 5th dynasty, speak of a time before time. That time before time is the antediluvian period, the era of the Watchers, and of forbidden and sealed knowledge. The Edfu texts, one of the most complete corpuses of ancient Egyptian religion, describe the so-called Age of the Gods. In those texts, the primordial gods arrived in Egypt from a distant island that was destroyed by a great flood. That destroyed island is the territory where the fortress of Yam stood before the waters covered everything forever. The Shem-Su-Hor from that island brought world blueprints, temple designs, and measurements of cosmological origin. Those plans were not symbolic. They were technical construction instructions that the Egyptian priests guarded zealously. The Temple of Edfu itself was built following dimensions that the texts refer to as the plans that fell from the ancient sky. The proportions of the Great Pyramid of Giza encode the number pi and the golden ratio with absolute millimeter precision. Such precision isn't intuitive. It needs a mathematical system that couldn't have developed in just a few centuries. That system already existed before the flood, preserved in the stones and inner metals of the fortress of Yam. The descendants of Yam took him to the Nile, handed him over to the first priests, and disappeared into the dark time. But they left a genetic footprint that the Bible inadvertently recorded by describing the populations that Israel encountered later. The Sphinx of Giza poses questions that conventional archaeology has still not been able to satisfactorily answer. Their water erosion marks indicate an age that contradicts the official chronology of established dynastic Egypt. If the Sphinx is older than claimed, it was built by the Shem-Su-Hor, pre-flood guardians of knowledge. And the Shem-Su-Hor are the descendants of Yam, who brought to the Nile the stone technology of the fallen watchers. Ezekiel 32:27 mentions the fallen Nephilim as separated warriors who lie in Sheol with weapons. That verse places the Nephilim in the post-flood world in a way that contradicts the account of total extermination. Numbers 13:33 is even more direct. The spies claim to have seen the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, there. It was written centuries after the flood, turning the survival of the Nephilim into a fact with direct witnesses. The line that connects those post-diluvian testimonies with the antediluvian period always goes through the fortress of Yam. The Book of the Giants from Qumran describes the sons of the Watchers with proper names and complete genealogies. Among those names are figures that undoubtedly correspond to legendary rulers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. That genealogy crosses the flood without pause because Yam's strength functioned exactly as it was designed to do. The parallelism with Noah's Ark is perfect and intentional. Each structure preserved what its builder valued most. Noah preserved orthodox humanity, the covenant with God, and the mandate to build a new world based on pure faith. Yam preserved the technical knowledge, the hybrid lineage, and everything that divine judgment sought to eliminate definitively. Both succeeded, and that is why the post-diluvian world simultaneously contains the heritage of Noah and the heritage of Yam. Noah's inheritance is monotheism, the law, and the covenant between man and the divine that we continue to recognize today. Yam's legacy consists of the pyramids, the ziggurats, the mathematical codes, and the giants that the Bible recorded unintentionally. Goliath, the Philistine giant who faced David in the Valley of Elah, was not a genetic anomaly, but a continuation. His height of 6 cubits and a span, recorded in 1 Samuel 17, corresponds to about 2 meters 90 in reality. Middle Kingdom Egyptian texts detail populations of unusual height in Canaan and Sinai with precise geographical accuracy. These populations coincide exactly with the dispersal areas of the group that first descended from the fortress of Yam. Mesopotamian texts are equally explicit. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine, a superhuman giant. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a heroic adventure. It is the record of a family that preserved the blood of the Watchers. Gilgamesh seeks immortality, knowing his lineage had it before, searching for what the flood interrupted but did not destroy. That search is the echo of Yam's decision to reject ordinary mortality for what the texts call divine life. Nimrod, described in Genesis as the first great hunter, was also the founder of the world's first cities. Nimrod founded Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar, which is the region we now call Mesopotamia or modern Iraq. Rabbinical traditions describe Nimrod as a giant who wore the skins that God made for Adam. Those garments granted her power over animals, suggesting that they contained very ancient knowledge. Nimrod is the first post-diluvian king who tries to reconstruct the unity of knowledge that the flood attempted to fragment. The Tower of Babel was not just a building, it was the project to unify the knowledge of the Watchers under a single power. God confused the languages precisely because that project threatened to restore what the flood had tried to erase. Nimrod belongs to the line of Ham, the second son of Noah, but traditions link him to the inheritance of Yam. Some medieval commentators suggested that Nimrod was educated in knowledge that survived outside the Ark itself. This would make him the first post-diluvian heir of the knowledge archive preserved in the fortress of Yam. The stone fortress was not just a physical refuge, it was a declaration that some men rejected the divine contract. And that statement was transmitted through Sumer and Egypt as the substrate of all the great ancient civilizations. Babylonian astronomy calculated eclipses accurately centuries before Greek science reached that same level. That astronomy did not originate in Babylon. It was inherited from the Sumerian texts, which received it directly from the custodians. Those guardians preserved the stellar cycles of the watchers within the stone walls of the sacred fortress. The Mayan calendar has similarities with Mesopotamian calendars that archaeologists have not been able to explain well. However, the problem of Sumer does not end with its sudden appearance, but with what it left written about itself. The Sumerian tablets describe a council of gods deliberating on human fate with total divine coldness. That advice was not decided by the flood out of whim, but because the mixture between the Watchers and humans was already irreversible. The Anunnaki knew in advance what would happen, because they themselves had caused the original problem. Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, secretly warned Utnapishtim about the flood, just as God warned Noah. But Enki was also able to warn others who had the technical knowledge to build a stone fortress. The parallel between Noah and Utnapishtim is well known. What is hidden is the parallel between Yam and those who did not need a boat. The texts of Nippur describe beings who survived the flood in the northern mountains without any vessel. Those beings descended after the waters, carrying what the texts call the tablets of the fate of men. The tablets of destiny are the Sumerian equivalent of the knowledge archive that the guardians of Yam preserved. In Egypt, the equivalent of those tablets are the so-called coffin texts of the late Middle Kingdom. Those texts describe the journey of the soul through an underground world using maps that no one could invent from scratch. The maps of the Egyptian afterlife presuppose a cosmological knowledge that could not be developed in the available time. They presuppose an astronomical and geographical tradition much older, preserved and transmitted since before the flood. The priests of Heliopolis, guardians of the oldest texts of Egypt, claim to descend from primordial times. Those primordial times are exactly the antediluvian era, where the Watchers taught and the Nephilim ruled. The link between the priests of Heliopolis and the fortress of Yam is not speculation. It is confirmed by the texts of Edfu. Edfu explicitly describes the arrival of the divine founders from the north, bearing the plans of the primordial temple. Those similarities between cultures separated by oceans point to a common origin predating all civilizations. That origin is what the texts we have recovered tonight identify as the strength of Noah's fourth son. The fourth son did not reject the ark out of pride. He possessed a knowledge that made the ark unnecessary. Its strength survived the flood, and with it, the lineage and complete knowledge of the Watchers survived forever. The builders of Sumer and the Shensu Hor of the Nile were their direct and perfectly traceable descendants. The giants that Israel encountered in Canaan were not spontaneous mutations. They were an ancient, continuous genetic line. Each pyramid and each ziggurat is the signature of the guardians of the fortress of Yam that crossed the flood intact and whole. History erased Yam because his survival proved that divine judgment was not as absolute as the canon establishes. What survived in that fortress was not a rebel, but the complete archive of the civilization that God tried to erase. The biblical editors and medieval theologians knew exactly what they were hiding when they erased his name from the canon. They were hiding the evidence that the flood started a war of knowledge that is still fought in the permitted texts. In the forbidden texts lies the truth of the man who chose stone over wood and changed the ancient world. This story is just the surface of a file of forbidden texts that history has hidden for entire centuries. Every detail you heard today is documented in verifiable sources, and each source leads to deeper truths. If you want to continue down this path of mysteries that official books never mention, the next video is waiting for you. Subscribe now so you don't miss the apocryphal texts and biblical mysteries that official history prefers to silence. Like if you made it this far, because you are one of the few who still seeks the truth beyond the official version.